Big Shaq walked into the grocery store expecting nothing but a quick errand. Then he saw the old man, shaking, nervous, looking over his shoulder like he knew something was coming. 3 men appeared, moving like shadows with purpose, their eyes locked onto him. They blocked the exit, their leader smirking as he said, "You've had a long day. No need to make it longer." Shaq wasn't stupid. This wasn't random. Then they turned to him. "Walk away." But some debts never die, and neither do the men sent to collect them. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. The grocery store buzzed with the usual chaos, shopping carts rattling, checkout scanners beeping, the faint hum of conversations blending with the occasional crying child. The air smelled like freshly baked bread near the bakery aisle, mixed with the sharp scent of cleaning supplies somewhere in the distance. Big Shaq strolled through the store with his usual laid-back swagger, his oversized hoodie slightly unzipped, revealing a crisp white tee underneath. He wasn't in a rush. If anything, he enjoyed these grocery runs. They were his version of peace, a rare moment where he wasn't being pulled into someone else's mess. He tossed a box of cereal into his cart, then grabbed a bottle of orange juice, shaking it slightly before setting it down. He had his habits, little things he did without thinking. He took his time, checking expiration dates, occasionally nodding at passing employees, and even throwing a casual grin at a kid staring at him. Then, something caught his eye. Near the produce section, an elderly man stood hunched over, struggling to balance a small basket overloaded with canned goods, bread, and a gallon of milk. His frail hands trembled as he attempted to shift the weight, but it was clear he was having a hard time. His clothes were neat but worn, his thin jacket hanging off his shoulders like it barely belonged to him. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, his breathing uneven. Big Shaq paused, gripping the handle of his cart as he observed the scene. People walked past the man without a second glance. A couple standing near the fruit display saw him, but quickly looked away, choosing to pretend they hadn't noticed. A store employee restocking shelves barely spared him a glance before continuing his work. The old man struggled again, nearly dropping a can of soup before catching it just in time. His knuckles turned white from the grip, his face tightening with quiet frustration. Shaq exhaled, rolling his tongue against the inside of his cheek. He wasn't one to butt into people's business, but something about this didn't sit right with him. He looked around once more, waiting to see if anyone would step in. But nobody did. A flicker of hesitation passed through him. He had 2 options: keep walking, and let this be someone else's problem, or step in. He scratched the back of his head, sighing as he made his decision. "Hey, old man," Shaq called out, making his way over. "Need a hand?" The elderly man flinched slightly at the voice, turning to look at him with wary eyes. There was something in his gaze, something just beneath the surface, like he wasn't used to people offering help, or maybe he didn't trust it. For a moment, Shaq thought the man would refuse. But then, his grip faltered, and the milk in his basket tilted dangerously. Without waiting for an answer, Shaq reached out, steadying the basket with one hand. "Relax. I got it," he said. The old man hesitated, then slowly let go. His hands flexed, the tension in his shoulders slightly easing as Shaq took the weight off him. "Thank you," the man muttered, his voice rough, almost reluctant. "No big deal," Shaq shrugged, transferring the items into his own cart. You, doing okay?" The old man nodded stiffly, but there was something off about the way he did it. Too quick, too dismissive. He looked around, like he was expecting someone or something. "Just needed a few things," he said, voice tight. "Didn't think it'd be this heavy." Shaq studied him for a moment. Something wasn't adding up. He wasn't just an old man struggling with groceries. There was something in his posture, the way his eyes darted, the slight tremor in his fingers. It wasn't just age, it was fear. Shaq didn't know why, but a strange feeling settled in his gut, like he had just stepped into something bigger than he realized, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what came next. Big Shaq shifted the weight of the elderly man's groceries into his own cart, keeping a casual expression as if it was no big deal. But in reality, something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him. The old man wasn't just struggling with his groceries, he was tense, his body language screaming discomfort. His fingers flexed at his sides, as if he was unsure whether to snatch the bags back or let Shaq help. His eyes flickered around the store, scanning the aisles, the checkout lanes, even the security cameras in the corners. It wasn't the usual kind of nervousness you'd see in someone embarrassed to accept help. This was something else. "All right, we're good," Shaq said, shifting the bags into his own cart with ease. "You grabbing anything else, or are we headed to the checkout?" The old man hesitated. His lips pressed together, as if he was weighing his next words carefully. Then, almost too quickly, he shook his head. "Number, that's it," he muttered. "Just need to pay and get going." Shaq nodded, pushing the cart forward, but he kept an eye on the man beside him. The way he walked, slightly hunched, steps quick and purposeful, gave off the vibe of someone who wanted to leave the store as fast as possible. Every few seconds his head would turn slightly, like he was checking for something behind him. Shaq had seen that kind of behavior before. Not from old men running errands, though. More like guys who thought they were being followed. They reached the checkout lane, and Shaq noticed how the man hesitated before pulling out his wallet. His hands trembled slightly, making it difficult for him to get a grip on his cash. Shaq frowned. If the guy had a medical condition, it wasn't his place to pry. But this didn't seem like just age. There was a deep, underlying fear in the way he moved, like he was bracing for something bad to happen. "You all right?" Shaq asked, keeping his tone light, but his eyes sharp. The man flinched at the question, then forced a tight smile. Yeah, I'm fine," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The cashier, a bored-looking teenager with earbuds tucked beneath her hoodie, barely acknowledged them as she scanned the items. Shaq tapped his fingers against the handle of the cart, still watching the old man closely. And then, just as the cashier handed him his change, the man leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be helping me, son." Shaq's body stiffened at the words. For a second, he thought he misheard. But the look in the old man's eyes confirmed that he hadn't. There was no gratitude in them, no relief, only warning. Shaq's instincts kicked in immediately. He glanced around, scanning the store the way he had seen the old man do earlier. His eyes darted over the customers, the workers, the security cameras. Everything looked normal, just another grocery store on an average day, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. The man pocketed his change and gripped his bag tightly. His breathing had become shallow, his shoulders more rigid. It was like he was preparing himself for something. Shaq wasn't sure what the old man was afraid of, but suddenly, he was afraid too. The grocery store was alive with its usual chaos. Checkout scanners beeping, carts rattling, idle conversations merging into an indistinct hum. Somewhere near the bakery section, a kid whined for candy, his mother's tired voice warning him against it. A stock boy refilled shelves with bags of chips, moving methodically, unaware of the storm brewing just a few aisles away. Big Shaq had been in plenty of uncomfortable situations before, but this one? This was different. As he and the elderly man stepped away from the checkout lane, the air around them shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the sudden drop in temperature before a storm. It wasn't obvious to the average shopper. It wasn't loud. But Shaq's instincts caught it immediately. Something was wrong. His eyes flicked to the side, scanning the movement just beyond the shelves. 3 men emerged from different aisles, moving with quiet purpose, their gazes locked onto the old man like predators tracking prey. They weren't browsing like normal shoppers. They didn't have baskets or carts, didn't pause to check prices or pretend to be interested in the rows of candy near the registers. They were here for one thing. Shaq's muscles tensed as they closed in, positioning themselves just right. By the time he realized what they were doing, it was too late. They had already cut off the exit. The old man beside him went eerily still. His knuckles whitened as he clutched the grocery bag tighter, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. His breathing turned shallow, his chest rising and falling in short, panicked bursts. Shaq didn't like this. Didn't like the way the old man had already accepted something was about to go down. Didn't like the way these guys moved. Smooth, confident, too damn comfortable with confrontation. He wasn't sure what was happening yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't random. He quickly assessed the three men. The leader stood front and center, taller than the others, lean, but built like he knew how to handle himself. His sharp jawline and cold, unreadable eyes made him look like someone who didn't talk unless it mattered. His clothes were clean but practical, the kind you could move fast in. His hands were tucked casually into his jacket pockets. That bothered Shaq. Guys like this? They never kept their hands in their pockets unless they were sure they wouldn't need them. The other two men flanked him, slightly behind but perfectly placed. One was stockier, his stance wider like he was used to shoving people around. The other was lean, wiry, his sharp eyes moving fast, scanning for threats. Shaq had seen enough setups in his time to recognize one. These guys were trained. They didn't need to talk to know what the other was thinking. They had done this before. The leader's eyes flicked to Shaq for just a second before settling on the old man. Then, a slow smirk crept onto his lips. "You've had a long day, old man." His voice was low, controlled, almost amused. "No need to make it any longer." The old man swallowed hard but said nothing. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight. He looked like a man standing at the edge of a steep drop, knowing there was no way down that wouldn't hurt. Shaq shifted his stance slightly, planting his feet. He wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what was happening. This wasn't some random beef. This was organized, deliberate. The old man had been expecting this, dreading it. Shaq exhaled through his nose, his mind working fast. The exit was blocked. There were other shoppers around, some still in line, others grabbing carts. But no one seemed to notice what was happening. Or maybe they did. Maybe they were choosing not to see it. That didn't sit right with him. The leader took a slow step forward, eyes still locked onto the old man. "Let's not make this difficult," he said, a hint of mockery lacing his tone. "Just come with us." Quietly. The old man's grip on his grocery bag tightened. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to run, but knew he couldn't. Shaq could feel the moment closing in on itself, the tension coiling tighter and tighter, waiting to snap. Then the leader's gaze flicked to him. The smirk widened slightly. "This ain't your business," he said, voice smooth as silk. "Walk away." Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Something about the way the guy said it, so casual, like Shaq was just another piece of furniture in the room, rubbed him the wrong way. He wasn't the kind of man you just dismissed. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken warnings. The two men flanking the leader shifted slightly, adjusting their footing, as if anticipating a response. Shaq knew what was happening. They were testing him, feeling him out, deciding how much of a problem he was about to be. He had been in enough fights to recognize the signs. This wasn't a brawl waiting to happen. This was something worse. A decision. A moment that would determine everything that followed. Shaq could feel the weight of the choice hanging in the air, pressing down on him. He had two options. Option 1, step aside. Let them take the old man. Pretend this wasn't his problem. It would be easy, clean, the logical thing to do. Option 2, stand his ground. Get involved in something he didn't fully understand. Make this his fight. His fists itched at his sides, his instincts screamed at him. Everything in him knew. If he made the wrong move here, things would get ugly. Fast. The leader's smirk didn't falter, but there was something in his eyes now. Interest. Calculation. He was waiting to see what Shaq would do, waiting to see if he'd make the smart choice. But Shaq had never been the type to play smart when his gut told him otherwise. His gut was telling him one thing: don't move, don't look away, don't back down. So he didn't. He lifted his chin slightly, squared his shoulders, and held the leader's gaze. Then, after a beat of silence, he said, "Make me." The smirk faded. The energy in the air shifted. And just like that, the standoff had begun. Big Shaq didn't move. He stood firm, his hands resting casually on the card handle, but there was nothing relaxed about his posture. His broad shoulders squared, his stance solid, his jaw locked. The air around him felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing against his chest, warning him that things were about to get worse. The leader of the three men smirked at him, The kind of smirk that came from a man who had spent years getting what he wanted. It wasn't arrogance, not exactly. It was certainty. Certainty that Shaq was just a clueless bystander who didn't know what he was stepping into. Certainty that he would fold, step aside, let things play out. Shaq could see it in his eyes. The guy wasn't even considering the possibility that Shaq would stand his ground. That only made Shaq more determined to stay exactly where he was. The leader's smirk twitched slightly, irritation flickering at the edges. I said, "This ain't your business," the leader repeated, his voice still smooth, still controlled, but now with an edge of impatience. The two men behind him shifted slightly, their weight adjusting. Their eyes weren't on the old man anymore. They were on Shaq now. They weren't just focused on their target anymore. They were assessing a threat. Shaq exhaled slowly through his nose, his mind working fast. He wasn't stupid. He had been around enough rough situations to recognize what was happening here. These guys weren't just some random punks looking for trouble. They moved with purpose, their confidence stemming from something deeper. Experience, power, something dangerous lurking beneath the surface. Shaq had seen guys like them before. The kind who didn't start fights unless they already knew how they were going to end. If they were expecting him to back down just because they told him to, they were about to be real disappointed. He glanced at the elderly man beside him. The guy was shaking now, but not just from fear. There was something else, something deeper. His eyes darted back and forth, scanning, calculating, like a man who had spent his entire life thinking 5 steps ahead. Shaq frowned. This wasn't just fear. This was recognition. And then, just barely above a whisper, the old man muttered, "You really don't know who I am, do you?" Shaq's brows furrowed. The words hit differently, not just because of what was said, but how it was said. The weight in the old man's voice wasn't just fear, it was something else entirely. The leader's smirk faded slightly. His eyes darkened, losing the trace of amusement they had carried a moment ago. "Don't do this," he warned, his tone losing its mockery. But it was already too late. The old man inhaled sharply, then exhaled through his nose, like he had just made peace with something. And when he spoke again, his voice was low but steady. 30 years ago, he started, his eyes fixed ahead. There wasn't a single deal that went down in this city without my approval. Not one. You wanted in? You came through me. You wanted out? You paid the price. Shaq blinked. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't that. The old man's grip on his grocery bag tightened, his fingers turning white as they curled around the plastic. I built an empire from nothing. His voice was level, but there was something behind it. Something old and buried, like the embers of a fire that had long been put out, but still smoldered beneath the ashes. And when I walked away, I made damn sure no one could follow. Shaq's mind worked quickly, piecing things together. Whispers, stories he had heard growing up, names spoken in hushed tones, always followed by a warning to never ask too many questions. The kind of men who ran entire cities from the shadows. Ghosts of the past. They were supposed to be dead, or rotting away in some prison cell. And yet, standing in front of him was a man claiming to be one of them. The leader of the 3 men exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. For the first time, he didn't look amused. He looked annoyed.